In this video, we're going to talk about the type of a variable. And just simply put, a type of a variable is the set of possible values that a variable can store. Okay, so the first thing to get used to about the Java programming language is that every variable must have a type. You must tell the Java compiler what you plan to store in a particular variable when you use it. So, all right, in Java there are two broad classes of types, and those are the primitive types and the reference types. In Java there are 8 primitive types: byte, short, int, long, float, double, char, and Boolean. All right, let's talk about each one of those. So the first are integer types: byte, short, int, and long. They are integer, which is just a whole number type. So if you need to store a whole number, then you can store that in a variable of type byte, short, int, or long. Byte is the smallest type. It can only store numbers from negative 128 to positive 127. Short can store bigger numbers. Int, even bigger numbers than short. And long, even bigger numbers than int. So you might ask, hey, well, why do you have 4 different types for storing just whole numbers? And the reason for that is because byte and short, these types take up less memory than int and long do. The thing is you can't store bigger numbers in there. But Java is used in all kinds of places, in appliances like a refrigerator or dryer or things like that. And in those kinds of applications, you don't want or need a bunch of memory. You don't need to store massive numbers like these here, right? So you would just try to conserve space as much as possible, conserve memory as much as possible by using the smaller types in there. So smaller types take up less memory, but you can't store big numbers in them. So, and for us, we're just programming on a desktop which has plenty of memory, so we're going to go with just the type int, which is that will be our kind of default type for storing whole numbers. So we really won't have much occasion to use byte, short, or long, but there are reasons for having those. Next up are the floating point types, and the floating point types, float and double, they're used for storing decimal numbers, so things with decimal points in them. So just like with the integer types, float and double can store numbers of different sizes. You can see the sizes on float and double, right? Double is a lot bigger than float, but float also takes up less memory. And just for us, we're going to use double as the floating point type most often, so we won't use float that much in this first course. You can see some details on how these are stored, how the computer stores floating point numbers. Remember, everything has to be stored as zeros and ones, so there's a standard for how you would store those things, and this kind of explains a little bit of how that would work. So we're not going to go much into detail, but if you're interested in that, you can take a look at that link. The one thing that we will have to be careful of is the following. You can see that double stores a pretty wide range of numbers, right? That's a really small number and that's a really large number. But still, there is a maximum and a minimum number that can be stored in there. And if you think about decimal numbers, there are infinitely many different decimal numbers in there, but the computer can only store a finite amount. So what that means is that there are, in fact, infinitely many numbers, right, that the computer can't represent exactly in there. So that means that there's always going to be some error associated with float and doubles, and and we'll see later that you have to be careful about that situation. All right, next up is the char type. The char type can only store a single character at a time, such as letters, digits, and other alphanumeric characters. They're similar to how strings can be enclosed in quotation marks. We've already talked about that. And the values for char, however, are enclosed in single quotes. So single quotes for char and double quotes for strings. Now you might ask, hey, if I have string, why would I use char? And we'll see some good reasons to take a look at char. However, most of the time we will use strings, but you can kind of think of char as the beginnings of the string class. Okay, so strings are sequences of characters basically, and so it's more of a basic thing than string. Finally, the Boolean type is the simplest type. A variable that's a Boolean type can only store two things. It can store true or false. Both of these are reserved keywords in Java, so that's it for a Boolean variable. It's either true or false. The reference types are types that are based on classes, and we've already seen a couple of these in the first program that we did. We saw string is a reference type, and remember, string contains sequences of characters. One thing to notice is that all of the primitive types have names that begin with lowercase letters, and the reference types, since they're based on classes, right? And remember, we're supposed to follow the naming convention and start class names with uppercase letters. So that means that you'll be able to distinguish the reference types because they will start with uppercase letters. System was one that we already talked about as well from our basic program. And we will talk a lot more about reference types later in the course. All right, and that's it on types. In the next video, we'll talk about how to actually issue the commands inside of your program that allows you to use these variables.